Okay, so basically now you know what happens if you don't read your chapters that you're supposed to. Yeah, Carter, what's up?
So every time that we get chapter homework, we have a quiz on it?
Not every time, but you never know. So I would always just be prepared if you have homework to read a book, read your chapter. I would read your chapter just in case. So, yeah, what's up?
What if you read the chapter but you don't have the best memory?
Just do your best then. So yeah, I myself have fallen victim to the not reading and then having a pop quiz many a times, and it kind of sucks. So let's do story time now, which is chapter 3. Let me reposition this. Okay, so chapter 3. I will stop every once in a while to ask you guys some questions about your reading, or what I'm reading, like what that means. Okay. When I had attained the age of 17, my parents resolved that I should become a student at the University of Ingolstadt. I had hitherto attended the schools of Geneva, but my father thought it necessary for the completion of my education that I should be made acquainted with other customs than those of my native country. My departure was therefore fixed at an early date, but before the day resolved upon could arrive, the first misfortune of my life occurred. An omen, as it were, of my future misery. Elizabeth had caught the scarlet fever. Her illness was so severe that she was in the greatest danger. During her illness, many arguments had been urged to persuade my mother to refrain from attending to her. She had at first yielded to our entreaties, but when she heard that the life of her favorite was menaced, she could no longer control her anxiety. She attended her sickbed. Her watchful attentions triumphed over the malignity of distemper. Elizabeth was saved, but the consequences of this imprudence were fatal to her preserver. On the third day, my mother sickened. Her fever was accompanied by the most alarming symptoms, and the looks of her medical attendants prognosticized the worst event. On her deathbed, the fortitude and benignity of the best of women did not desert her. She joined the hands of Elizabeth and myself. "My children," she said, my firmest hopes of your future happiness were placed on the prospect of your union. This expectation will now be the consolation of your father. Elizabeth, my love, you must supply my place to my younger children. Alas, I regret that I am taken from you, and happy and beloved as I have been, it is not hard to quit you all. But these are not thoughts befitting me. I will endeavor to resign myself cheerfully to death, and will indulge a hope of meeting you in another world." What do you guys think it means when she's talking about the union between Elizabeth and Victor? Marriage. So they're going to get married, right? Yeah. So their mom has always wanted them to get married. But the thing is, Elizabeth and Victor really aren't siblings, because where did she come from?
A different family.
Yeah, so they adopted her, right? And she came from Milan? Good. So they're gonna get married. I know, kind of weird. How do you feel about that? Yeah, Tulani.
I mean, this is not the first time I've heard people saying, well, it's not technically wrong since they're not actually related and they're adopted. Yeah. But I still think it's weird nonetheless, especially in the context that I first discovered it in. So.
Oh yeah, no, it's definitely weird. I never said it was okay, but that's what's gonna happen here. She died calmly, and her countenance expressed affection even in death. I need not describe the feelings of those whose dearest ties are rent by the most irreparable evil, the void that presents itself to the soul, and the despair that is exhibited on the countenance. It is so long before the mind can persuade itself that she whom we saw every day, and whose very existence appeared a part of our own, can have departed forever, that the brightness of a beloved eye can have been extinguished, and the sound of a voice so familiar and dear to the ear can be hushed, never more to be heard. These are the reflections of the first days, but when the lapse of time proves the reality of the evil, then the actual bitterness of grief commences. Yet from whom has not the rude hand rent away some dear connection? And why should I describe a sorrow which we have all felt and must feel? The time at length arrives when grief is rather an indulgence than a necessity, then the smile that plays upon the lips, although it may be deemed a sacrilege, is not banished. My mother was dead, but we had still duties which we ought to perform. We must continue our course with the rest and learn to think ourselves fortunate whilst one remains whom the spoiler had not seized. Would anyone else like to read? Any volunteers? Yeah, Tulani.
All right. Are you gonna just tell me when to stop?
Yeah, just read, or let's do some popcorn reading. So when I read a paragraph or two, and then we'll call on someone else, but I will still ask some questions throughout.
All right. My departure for Ingolstadt, which had been deferred by these events, was now again determined upon. I obtained from my father a respite of some weeks. It appeared to me sacrilege to so soon leave the repose, akin to death, of the house of mourning and to rush into the thick of life. I was new to sorrow, but it did not the less alarm me. I was unwilling to quit the sight of those that remained to me, and above all, I desired to see my sweet Elizabeth in some degree consoled. She indeed veiled her grief and strove to act the comforter to us all. She looked steadily on life and assumed its duties with courage and zeal. She devoted herself to those whom she had been taught to call her uncle and cousins. Never was she so enchanting as at this time, when she recalled the sunshine of her smiles and spent them upon us. She forgot even her own regret in her endeavors to make us forget. The day of my departure at length arrived. Clerval spent his last evening with us. He had endeavored to persuade his father to permit him to accompany me and become my fellow student, but in vain. His father was a narrow-minded traitor and saw idleness and ruin in the aspirations and ambition of his son. Henry felt deeply the misfortune of being debarred from a liberal education. He said little, but when he spoke, I read in his kindling eye and in his animated glance a restrained but firm resolve not to be chained to the miserable details of commerce. Should I continue?
Would you like to?
Sure.
Okay.
We sat late. We could not tear ourselves away from each other, nor persuade ourselves to say the word farewell. It was said, and we retired unto the pretense of seeking repose, each fancying that the other was deceived. But when at morning's dawn I descended to the carriage, which was to convey me away, they were all there. My father again to bless me, Clerval to press my hand once more, my Elizabeth to renew her entreaties, and that I would write often, and to bestow the last feminine attentions on her playmate and friend.
Okay, I'll go from here. I threw myself into the chase that was to convey me away and indulged in the most melancholy reflections. I, who had ever been surrounded by amiable companions, continue engaged in endeavoring to bestow mutual pleasure. I was now alone. In the university whither I was going, I must form my own friends and be my own protector. My life had hitherto been remarkably secluded and domestic, and this had given me invincible repugnance to new countenances. I loved my brothers, Elizabeth and Clerval. They were old familiar faces, but I believed myself totally unfitted for the company of strangers. Such were my reflections as I commenced my journey. But as I proceeded, my spirits and hopes rose. I ardently desired the acquisition of knowledge. I had often, when at home, thought it hard to remain during my youth cooped up in one place, and had longed to enter the world and take my station among other human beings. Now my desires were complied with. It would indeed have been folly to repent. So words are hard sometimes. Let's predict. Is it a good or a bad thing that Victor is alone? What do we think? Yeah, Tyrion.
I think it's a bad, that he's alone.
Yeah, he's.
I think it's a bad thing mainly because if he's grieving and you're alone, then I don't think good things can come from that.
Yeah.
Mental health is serious.
Yeah, good. And what about things you already know about Frankenstein from the novel or from popular culture? What happens when he's alone? Yeah.
Well, I feel like he would kind of his general desire for knowledge and whatnot would probably lead him to do some more, interesting, I'll say, things, and without someone else to kind of be his voice of reason, he might kind of get absorbed too much in that.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a bad thing. So let's continue. Would anybody like to volunteer to read from I Had Sufficient Leisure? I can just cold call on someone. Chariot, thank you.